Hello, everyone. My name is Teresa Ghilarducci, and I'm the director of the Bernard Schwartz Center on Economic Policy Analysis. We are a center embedded in the New School's economics department. We are dedicated to bringing in heterodox economic frameworks to solve mainstream economic problems, especially those facing workers all around the world and other marginalized and vulnerable people. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Heilbroner lecture. Before I start, I would like to draw your attention to our hashtag. That's a hashtag. That's, yeah, a pound sign. Darity is our speaker's name. And to thank Audra Aucoin for all the work that you've done to make this happen. It's not done yet, and so when it succeeds and it's over, it'll be Audra's work. Thank you so much. I want to tell you a little bit about Robert Heilbroner. He was the Norman Thomas Professor of Economics in our department from 1971 to the mid-90s. He was a highly unconventional economist, just the way we like it. He was preoccupied with worldly affairs, and you might know him as the author first of The Worldly Philosophers that was first published in 1943. I didn't know that it sold nearly 4 million copies, and it's still selling today. It sold more copies than Paul Samuelson's economics books. And I'm probably not alone in reading it in high school, and it was one of the books that influenced me, and probably many of you, to be an economist. He was unusual. He was highly controversial and unconventional, but he was welcomed by the profession. In 1972, Robert Heilbroner, who we honor today, was elected vice president of the American Economics Association. It is also my pleasure tonight to introduce my colleague and the president of the New School. David Van Zandt has been our president since 2010. Was that right? 11? Was nominated by our board in 2010. And with candor, with competency, and a huge amount of compassion, which are the 3 C's of a highly effective and motivating leader. He has and is leading the New School into the strongest period ever for our university. So thank you very much for coming tonight, David.
Thank you. Thank you, Teresa. That's way too kind, but I have to, is this on? Yeah. I have to say that Bob Heilbroner, very much like you, he had a big influence on me in the sense, he was my introduction to the New School back, I think, when I was in high school. And I read the same book. Now, I didn't become an economist, I became a sociologist, but you know, they're closely related to that. So this certainly means a lot to me personally. You know, in the history or in the legacy of the New School, the kinds of questions that we're going to discuss tonight are right front and center. And I knew when I arrived that Sandy Darity was the Ph.D. advisor for our own Derek Hamilton. What I didn't realize, Lance, that he was your advisor. So I think we've done some pretty good work here all the way around, right? So we should pat ourselves on the back. But again, you know, tonight's question, I don't think it's particularly simple. Actually, I think some of the empirics behind it are reasonably simple and straightforward. I think the real issue is, how do you design a policy? How do you come up with a public policy, design a policy that actually addresses the problems that the issue raises? And Sandy, you've been a standard bearer for this work, an advocate for new approaches to it, and we're really honored to have you here tonight. So now let me just stop and turn it over to Derek Hamilton, our own Derek Hamilton, the Associate Professor of Economics and Urban Policy with Milano, who's going to moderate us tonight. And as I mentioned, he is one of Sandy's, I think, most renowned students, and we're very proud to have Derek with us. So come on up.
So it gives me great pleasure to introduce William Sandy Darity, Jr., who is the Samuel DuBois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies, and Economics at Duke University. One of the many lessons that I've learned from Sandy is that brevity is oftentimes better. So I'm going to try to do that, but I don't always succeed. Sandy's scholarly and service accomplishments are unsurpassed. Calling him brilliant would be an understatement. The breadth and depth of his scholarship is outstanding. He is perhaps most noted for his prolific work, both theoretical and empirical, examining intergroup inequality in both international and domestic contexts. His work is careful, insightful. It takes nothing for granted. It challenges the conventional wisdom and the status quo, especially when that status quo perpetuates a system that locks in inequality. He has authored and edited over 10 books and 250 articles. Did I mention that he is prolific? His scholarship not only advances the professional literature, it is trailblazing. Sandy's work is remarkably interdisciplinary. The extent of his knowledge and his ability to process information is profound. I've heard from many people, and I concur, that regardless of the topic, he is often the brightest person in the room. These same people would also concur that he is the antithesis of an elitist. He engages with others, and to a remarkable degree, he shows humility and respect for them. He is motivational. He pushes people to levels of success that they themselves have not conceived of for themselves. All the accolades above do little to describe his endearing human qualities. I have witnessed him light up a room with his affectionate smile and boisterous laugh, play his harmonica, which he does professionally, root for his Tar Heels, and the selfless, genuine respect, non-judgmental way that he interacts with people from all walks of life is amazing. There are many accounts that I can cite of the ways in which he has weighty influence on me personally. But rather than cite them, I will end by just noting the privilege that it has been to be his student, his colleague, and most of all, his friend. And for that privilege, I am extremely grateful. Thank you, Sandy.
Wow. Thank you, Derek. And President Van Zandt, you might be interested in knowing that for some peculiar reason, I'm the current president-elect of the Association of Black Sociologists, even though I'm an economist, right? Okay. Well, I'm very honored to give a lecture that respects and celebrates the memory of Robert Heilbroner. He was one of the rare economists with a deep moral compass and a desire to produce a more just and fair world. And I hope that my talk this evening will be in the same spirit as his life's work. I would like to begin by clearing away some debris. And I want to share 3 observations with you at the outset in the interest of full disclosure. So the first of these is, I have no truck with notions of a biogenetic basis for race classification and correspondingly notions of race-specific diseases or race-specific drug therapies. Inequalities in diseases or illnesses between socially identified groups are manifestations of a more general set of socially created inequalities. Disease inequalities across racial and ethnic groups generally accompany or are layered with some other types of disparities encountered by the same groups. Second, I also have no truck with cultural explanations for group-based inequalities. With respect to the epidemiology of a disease, I reject the view that differences in the incidence and distribution of disease is explained by group-based differences in health behaviors, driven in turn by cultural differences. And the third observation I want to make at the outset is I have to confess that I'm going to be talking about health-related issues eventually in this talk, But as I'm an economist, not a public health scholar, I will have a lot to say about public health issues as the evening progresses. But that's natural because economists are the most imperial of social scientists, invading nearly every corner of analysis of the human condition. However, frequently, the imperial economists invade terrain previously outside their scope by virtually ignoring all of the research that had been done by non-economists on the subject. I recall a few years ago, my fellow economist, Roland Fryer Jr., invoked the hoary slavery salt retention hypothesis to explain the higher rates of hypertension among African Americans. Fryer apparently was completely unaware of the research of epidemiologists like Jay Kaufman, the historian Philip Curtin, and evolutionary biologists like Joseph Graves that had thoroughly debunked this hypothesis. So I want to be sure that in my comments this evening, I pay close attention to the powerful research that has been conducted by non-economists that's relevant to the discussion that we will have tonight. But as an economist, I also want to provide a sketch of the foundation of racial and ethnic inequality that's anchored in material conditions, okay? So my impulse is always to go to the material conditions, okay? Part of this project is to achieve an integration between the methods of quantitative social sciences and the spirit of subaltern studies. I'm going to argue that relative wealth is the critical indicator of economic inequality, and it also is the critical indicator of subaltern status. Okay? So groups that are in a distinctly inferior wealth position are the groups that I would identify as being characterized by subalternity. Now, what do I mean by wealth? Well, a simple, straightforward definition is that wealth is the difference between assets and debts. The stock of economic resources that are possessed by an individual, a household, or a family. Income is a flow of resources primarily generated from earnings. Wealth, however, are resources available via acts of ownership that can be carried as a store of value across time. Income constitutes resources available via compensation from employment, drawing down your stock of wealth, or public or private transfers. The Nobel laureate in economics, Amartya Sen, emphasized the notion that we should think about human well-beings in terms of functionings and capabilities. I would argue that wealth is an essential indicator of individuals, households, or families' capacity to engage in functionings or to have capabilities to participate fully in a society. First of all, wealthier families are better able to survive emergencies. My colleague Anirudh Krishna published a book in 2010 called One Illness Away, in which he argued that the descent into poverty is most frequently precipitated globally by families being confronted with medical emergencies, not only because of the costs that are associated with the care for the family member who has become ill, but also because that family member is not able to work and generate the same level of income that they previously could. In addition, another emergency might be created by exposure to unemployment. We should be particularly aware of this in the remaining clutch of the Great Recession. And generally, individuals or families or households with greater levels of wealth are more secure in a world where income can be volatile. So you may still be employed, but there might be sharp swings in the type of income that you receive. Secondly, wealth gives individuals political influence, particularly in our American plutocracy, which is largely controlled by the 1% that was identified by the Occupy movement. Third, greater wealth enables families to finance elite private education or buy homes in neighborhoods with access to elite public education. In addition, wealth enables households or families or individuals to have access to startup capital, to inaugurate businesses, to leverage borrowed funds, to provide gifts and bequests to descendants. Further, wealth enables individuals or families to purchase superior legal counsel. And finally, wealth enables families generally to have a greater sense of confidence in terms of pursuing projects that might be risky. Okay? So in discussing wealth disparities this evening, I'm going to rely on two major data sources. The first is the Survey of Income and Program Participation, which is a national survey. And the second is a survey that Derek and I have been responsible for coordinating the collection of with the support of the Ford Foundation. And it's a project that's referred to as the National Asset Scorecard for Communities of Color. This is a project in which we conducted a survey in 5 major American cities with an eye towards enabling us to get data or information about the net worth position of specific national origin groups. Now, what do I mean by that? So typically in most data sets, including the Survey of Income and Program Participation, you have clusters of folks who fall under the categories of Black, Hispanic, or Asian. What we wanted to do was to be able to disaggregate those categories, to distinguish between, for example, Blacks who are long-time residents of the United States, presumably who have ancestors who were enslaved in the United States, in contrast with more recent immigrants. We wanted to be able to distinguish among Asians between Japanese, Chinese, Cambodians, Koreans, and the like, and among Hispanics or Latinos, we wanted to be able to distinguish between, say, Dominicans and Puerto Ricans. So we selected a set of cities where we could have a good prospect of being able to narrow down to identify those very specific groups. The 5 cities that we selected were Boston, Los Angeles, Miami, Tulsa, and Washington, D.C. And we're hoping that there will be an opportunity to extend this survey instrument to other cities as we go further. So let me first talk about some of the evidence from the Survey of Income and Program Participation, the national study, in which we're using these more aggregate categories, white, Black, Asian, and Hispanic. And what's particularly notable about this is that in the interval between 2005, which was prior to the Great Recession, and 2011, there was a decline in the relative wealth position of Blacks in comparison with whites, with Latinos in comparison with non-Hispanic whites. Okay. And it's a very dramatic change, although we have to keep in mind that in 2005, the gap was astronomical, but it's even worse now. So essentially, it's moved for Blacks from approximately 10 cents to the dollar of median wealth that's held by whites to 6 cents per dollar of the median wealth that's held by whites. And for Hispanics in 2011, it's also approximately 6 cents per dollar held by non-Hispanic whites. Okay, so this is a very, very, very dramatic kind of change. What's also interesting is the fact that in 2005, the median net worth of Asians taken collectively in the United States was actually greater than the median net worth for non-Hispanic whites. It was $1.24 per dollar held by non-Hispanic whites. But by 2011, it had fallen below. In fact, in 2009, it was 68 cents, and then by 2011, it was 83 cents. What exactly occurred? Well, we speculate that this is attributable to the fact that a significant portion of America's Asian population is disproportionately concentrated in states that took the biggest hit in terms of home equity losses during the course of the Great Recession. And so that had the effect of significantly reducing their wealth position. Now, everybody's wealth fell during the course of the Great Recession, but the wealth fell much more dramatically for Blacks, Asians, and Hispanics than it did for non-Hispanic whites. Indeed, the magnitude of the gap in wealth between black or Latino families in contrast with non-Hispanic whites means that the median black or Latino family would have to save 100% of their income for 3 consecutive years to close the gap. And this is clearly an impossibility. Indeed, what's even more striking is the fact that once you control for the income level of households, there's not really a significant difference in savings practices by race. So Wolf and Gittleman's study in 2004 indicates that after you control for income, there's a similar savings rate between blacks and whites. And indeed, in some income categories, the black savings rate is modestly higher. And in addition, if you control for income, there are similar rates of return on portfolios. So we can't explain these gaps on the basis of behavioral differences around savings activity, okay? Something else is going on. When you look at liquid wealth, that is, by liquid wealth, we mean those forms of a household or family's assets that can be transferred rapidly into cash. So if we look at liquid wealth, we find that whites whites in 2011 had $23,000 at the median, while blacks had $200 and Hispanics had $340. So again, this is kind of a signal of how you can respond in emergency situations. Your capacity to convert your wealth into ready cash is much, much lower if you're black and Hispanic. And then if we considered liquid wealth that excludes retirement funds, okay? So whites have $3,000 at the median, Asians $3,000 at the median, Hispanics $100, and blacks $25. So there's this vast, vast discrepancy. Okay? So if we look at the National Asset Scorecard for communities of color data, in general, we typically were able to get about 400 to 500 observations for each of the cities. And if we take all the cities collectively, we had approximately US black descendants numbering 470, Caribbean blacks 143, blacks of recent immigration from the African continent about 78 observations across all of our cities. And then we have also Cape Verdeans who are also African immigrants, but a distinctive population that's only concentrated in the Boston area in our study, and we only had 24 observations for them. Among Latinos, we had about 173 observations for Mexicans, overwhelmingly concentrated in Los Angeles, but a significant presence in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Cubans, 110, Puerto Ricans, 105, Dominicans, 54, and so on. We chose Tulsa, Oklahoma because we wanted to be able to get some information about Native American respondents. And Tulsa appears to be a city in which there was the capacity to do that. And interestingly enough, in Tulsa alone, we were able to get responses from 112 individuals who had tribal enrollment status and were American Indians. And then we got another 70 who also described themselves as being American Indians but did not have tribal enrollment status. Then we were able to examine a wide variety of things, but what I want to highlight for you tonight is the use of a particular type of predatory lending. Okay. And these are payday loans. So who is most likely to rely upon payday lending? And if we were to look at the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, this is going to be a bit of an outlier because all of the groups in Tulsa, Oklahoma rely somewhat significantly on payday lending. In fact, the lowest rate of participation is for whites, but that's at about 10%. And that's actually a relatively high rate. The highest rate is among the Creek Indians with tribal enrollment, which is about 33%, which is the highest rate that we could identify across all of the groups in all of the cities that we examined. But if we were to make black-white comparisons, if we looked at Los Angeles, US black descendants had about a 27% rate of payday lending use. Again, that's almost comparable to the Creeks in Tulsa, while whites had a 2% rate. In Miami, blacks a 16% rate, whites a 3% rate. In Boston, which is a city where there's a fairly low use of payday lending, blacks had a 4% rate and whites had a 1% rate. In Tulsa, blacks a 16% rate and whites a 9% rate. And in DC, blacks an 8% rate and whites a 4% rate. So in almost every one of the cities, there's at least a 2-to-1 ratio in the incidence of reliance upon payday lending. We also can examine whether people are banked or unbanked. We can look at what types of assets they possess as a consequence of their responses to these questions. But again, I would like to consider the median value of liquid assets, again, because these are the funds that you can draw upon in emergency situations. And in all of our cities, the 5 cities, there's only one city in which U.S. black descendants had a median net worth in liquid assets that was in excess of $1,000, and that was D.C., where it was $5,000. But the comparable measure for whites in that city was $65,000. So again, if we're thinking about relative position, there's something substantial going on here. Okay? So I also want to address an argument that's frequently made that suggests that all of our social inequality problems can be solved by people getting more education. Okay. So I want to look at the relationship between education and wealth. And I want to be clear. I'm a college professor, so I'm fairly passionate about people acquiring education. But what I want to also make clear is that greater educational attainment does very little to close racial wealth gaps or other economic gaps. So here's the really telling statistic. The median wealth for whites with less than a high school education, folks who had never completed high school, in 2011, in the Survey of Income and Program Participation, was $34,700. Okay? For blacks with a college degree, it was $23,400. So whites who had never finished high school had a median net worth that was $10,000 higher than the median net worth for blacks who had college degrees. So education is far from a panacea. It does not overcome racial inequality. What it does mean is that a better educated black individual can do better than a less well-educated black individual. Okay? But it does not bridge the gap between blacks and whites. Here's another example. The unemployment rate for blacks with some college education is greater than the unemployment rate for whites who have not completed high school. And indeed, the unemployment rate for blacks in each educational category that you can identify is twice as high as the rate for whites. In fact, I've tended to use the unemployment rate gap as an index of the degree of discrimination in the society. Okay. So now I want to come to what's the real subject matter tonight, which is health. And I want to start by the relationship between education and health. Okay. And what's interesting here is there is a standard gradient for virtually all diseases that relates the socioeconomic status of white families to their health outcomes. So if we're thinking about, the holy trinity, obesity, diabetes, and hypertension, okay? If we were thinking about that, if we looked at the socioeconomic status of a white individual, the incidence of obesity, diabetes, and hypertension declines as socioeconomic status rises. Okay? When we start looking at populations or communities that have subaltern status, it disrupts that nice picture. So one example is the so-called Mexican health paradox. That is to say, low-income recent Mexican immigrants generally have better health outcomes than higher-income Mexican Americans. Interesting. In fact, the longer immigrants to the United States from Mexico are here, the worse their health outcomes become. South Asian mothers have birth outcomes that are as poor as low-income blacks, although they have a more favorable socioeconomic status profile. In the aftermath of 9/11, mothers in California with Arabic-sounding names had a significantly greater risk of preterm delivery and low birth weight children in California compared to the pre-9/11 period. So higher socioeconomic status does not translate into improved health outcomes for all groups. And if we are thinking about the status of blacks, I turn to Jay Pearson's observation in an article called "Can't Buy Me Whiteness," in which he argued that higher income does not get you the same conditions and privileges that are associated with being white. And he says, generally among African Americans, higher SES is more likely to reduce mortality rates than morbidity rates, suggesting that higher levels of income, education, and occupation may buy access to technology to forestall death, but they do less to reduce the incidence of disease or to lengthen healthy life expectancy. And so, I can personally attest to the fact that my comparatively affluent income has permitted me to have access to the medical treatment that has lengthened my life. But I've also been exposed to some very dramatic diseases. So my anecdotal response is that Pearson's observation is quite correct. Indeed, for some groups, depending on the disease, socioeconomic status may go up and the incidence of the disease might also go up. Indeed, variation among blacks based upon skin shade also displays the same kind of phenomenon that if you're darker complexioned, higher socioeconomic status is even less likely to buy you an improvement in your health outcomes. Okay? So in Pearson's work, there's been an emphasis on examining hypertension. And I'm going to come back to what might be at stake here in a moment, but Pearson says it's demonstrable that the rate of hypertension does not decline as socioeconomic status rises for black Americans. Okay? In fact, it's the opposite. It actually becomes higher. I've got some speculations as to why that's the case. So when we talk about socioeconomic status, though, customarily we're talking about income or occupation or the educational status of the individual. Now, there's something that gets omitted from most measures of socioeconomic status. And what do you all think that is, given the work that Derek and I have been doing? Yes, wealth. So there's an interesting puzzle about what the relationship is between wealth and health outcomes. We don't have a clear answer. Is it possible that if we were to take into account wealth in the process of trying to gauge socioeconomic status, would it eliminate these kinds of racial gaps? Would it reverse the gradient that we're talking about? Would increasing wealth necessarily close the health gaps? I'm not sure. There's a group of students at Duke who are working with Derek on a project in which they're trying to get at this issue, but that project is still a warning. Okay, so I think that wealth does make a difference, but I want to be fair about this. Excuse me. Because I said at the outset, I want to make sure I pay close attention to the kind of research that's been done by non-economists, okay? So Jay Pearson, who's an epidemiologist, expresses some skepticism about whether or not wealth necessarily will be associated with improvements in health outcomes for all groups. So, for example, the work that he's done with Arlene Geronimus demonstrates that there is an affluent community with greater wealth than whites in general that has worse health outcomes, an affluent community, okay? Who might this be? Want to guess? So it's Jewish Americans. They have significantly worse health outcomes than other whites once you take into account socioeconomic position. Okay? And of course, it's difficult to necessarily view American Jews as a subaltern group, so this might be hard to explain, but I'm going to offer some closing thoughts on this. It's very obvious why you might explain the phenomenon of the reverse health gradient for some subaltern groups when compared with whites, but groups that we don't necessarily classify as subaltern, it's more complicated. What's the story we might tell about subaltern groups? Well, we can argue that they are going to be confronted with a unique set of racialized and ethnicized stressors. And here I want to use a language that's become increasingly popular, but I think it's useful. A distinction between microaggressions and macroaggressions. And by macroaggressions, I mean those abuses that individuals might be subjected to that threaten life and limb. For example, police lynchings of blacks, et cetera, which is something, I think police lynchings of blacks demands an epidemiological perspective, but that's another story. Microaggressions, however, don't threaten your life and limb, but they impose indignities on individuals that erode the soul and their spirit. They create stresses, they produce physiological effects, they create the link between racism and being sick. Okay? And there are unique layers of stress, racialized layers of stress, that may actually increase or intensify for members of a subaltern group as they experience upward mobility, or if they are in higher status employment contexts in which they may be faced with a different set or a different type of racism. In fact, they may get greater exposure to microaggressions. Indeed, Sherman James, another epidemiologist, says that one should think about the problem that's associated with upward mobility for members of subaltern groups because it demands on their part something he calls high effort coping, that they have to do more to move further in a racist society. So what are the manifestations of this in terms of a physiological analysis? So there are three of them, and I think that they're related. The first is what we refer to as allostatic load, which is an index of the cumulative wear and tear on the body that might be associated with repeated surges in blood pressure due to the response to microaggressions. And this damages the blood vessel. It contributes to coronary artery disease. And indeed, among 45 to 60-year-old Mexicans, recent immigrants have lower allostatic load scores than US-born Mexican Americans, okay? The second thing is the weathering phenomenon, which is also related to allostatic load. This is a notion of premature aging, the prospect of your life being shorter. And the weathering phenomenon is the concept that Arlene Geronimus has developed, where she talks about this being a product of high effort coping, racialized stress, and the like. And the physiologists are now moving in the direction of trying to actually gauge weathering by measuring the length of telomeres. And so all this body of work is becoming a body of work that provides us with the capacity to answer the question that I pose in the title of this talk. Does racism make you sick? Yes, it literally makes you sick. So what about the non-subaltern groups, or groups that we don't perceive as subaltern in an economic sense, that display weaker health outcomes once you take into account socioeconomic position? For example, East Indians or Jews. Well, I would suggest that the narratives that I've been using today direct us to explore what unique layers of stress are faced by members of those groups. Okay? I'm not sure what they are necessarily, but that's what we should examine. Finally, I want to return to the wealth and health nexus. greater wealth may not reduce racialized stress for members of a subaltern community. But it can reduce the stressors that are associated with expenses for purchasing and maintaining a home, exposure to job loss, other types of major family emergencies, the capacity to support other family members who are particularly needy. So I suspect that even if it doesn't close the racial health gap, it's got to be helpful to have improved the wealth position of those who are most deprived of wealth. So I think, that it's vital on a number of dimensions to eliminate the racial wealth gap. And I'm very curious about what would happen to the racial health gap if we address the racial wealth gap. And I'm not going to spend much time now talking about policy options. Derek Hamilton and I have spent the past decade or so advocating something that we call a baby bonds proposal, and I'll be glad to elaborate on that in the Q&A. But however we do it, I think we must do it, and I'm curious about what the effect would be on health inequalities.
Well, thank you, Sandy. So next we're going to have two discussants, Anwar Sheikh and Teresa Galaducci. But I just want to make one quick observation before they take the podium. When you were talking about the increase in, well, one thing, I wonder if examining microaggressions relative to macroaggressions could be proxied somehow by an increase in relative mortality for blacks, but yet but consistent with an increase in relative morbidity, especially if microaggressions is more likely to explain morbidity and macroaggressions mortality. Yep.
Very
all right.
interesting. Yeah.
So I'll let you all come take the podium. Yep. Who's first?
Well, thank you, Teresa, for inviting me to this forum, and it's great to see Sandy and Derek I see more often, but see Sandy every once in a while. So I want to try to talk a little bit about the relation between racism and inequality, and about racism, inequality, and class, because that is a thing in the background. And one of the issues that arises, of course, is that, as Sandy and Derek have shown, and people have repeatedly shown, racism is linked to inequality, but obviously inequality is not entirely dependent on racism. And so that raises an interesting question. What is the goal of combating racism? And that includes combating discrimination by gender. And one goal, and this comes up in the early days of these debates, and certainly I'm as old as Sandy, so I can remember those days personally, is the goal integration, or is it to change the overall structure of inequality? Now you can think about one axis, inequality here, and categories such as gender and race and ethnicity here. And obviously, if you think of the inequality of the system as structural, as I do, then the idea of integration is an idea of an equal inequality, equal distributions of inequality by race and gender. And that was one of the earliest debates that came up in these issues. I remember in Teresa and my time and Sandy's time. So that's one possible answer. The other possible answer is to change the structure of inequality itself. Now that's not the same question, because obviously integrating into an existing structure is not the same as changing inequality. This is an issue, as I'm going to try to emphasize, that appears repeatedly in every country of the world and every time, and I want to link it to Amartya Sen and development also, and stay within my time limits. Piketty has recently revived this issue of structural inequality of capitalism, over long periods of time. And a claim that he makes is that it is really normally capitalism produces great inequality, and the period that we take to be the normal period, which is the post-war period, is an exception. That in fact what we've gone now back to is what's normal. I want to address that, but I want to bring that up because it then raises that issue sharply about integration versus changing inequality. And he particularly emphasizes that inequality, as he's talking about it, which is inequality by income and wealth, is really structurally based on the difference between income from labor and income from property. And so there's a relation between Sandy and Derek's work about the distributions of property and the structural inequality which comes about. And I have to say that in most parts of the world, perhaps not in the United States, I've only been here 50 years, so I'm not entirely familiar with it, but it seems to me in most parts of the world, this is called an issue of class. It's very fundamental. Now, my own work, part of the work on inequality, shows that you can, in fact, explain the overall distribution of inequality in a very simple way, dependent on only one variable. And that variable is a ratio of property income to labor income. To put it more formally, the Gini coefficient in every country can be shown to be related to this one variable. Now that's very interesting because it directly links to the work that Sandy was talking about, which is this huge discrepancy in the distribution of wealth, property income. Wealth is a source of property income, so that's a very crucial variable. And I'd love to see some more connection to the Piketty argument on that respect. But what I can show is that this is formally true, and it's derived actually from another body of work from Viktor Yakovenko and the physicists working with them, which is called the Econophysics two-class theory of income distribution. Now, I will not launch into the statistical mechanics of that, but it is very interesting stuff, and it has this powerful implication, which one can test empirically, that the distribution of income, the Gini coefficient, is derivable from one single variable alone. And just to say why, because I know I see many economists looking at me with puzzlement here, it's because they argue that the distribution of income from labor is an exponential distribution, and an exponential distribution has this property that its Gini coefficient is 0.5. And you can show this repeatedly. A group of people working with me here at the New School have shown that we can do it for labor, and Yakovenko has shown it also for IRS data. That means that the only part which is not 0.5 is the property income. And it's possible in the way they, a very clever physics trick, you show that you can link the two, and the link is the ratio of property income to non-property or labor income, and that's all you need. So what is the implication of that? If you think about the issue which Sandy said he would happy to talk about in questions, and it's the policy part of it, how do we intervene in both the distribution of wealth and income by race and the distribution of wealth and income by labor versus property? Because these are not independent things, they're linked, but obviously they have different determinations. You could say, look at groups, ethnic groups like American Jews or American Irish Catholics or whatever, and you can see their distributions also in this way. Do we want to talk about changing the pre-tax income? And if so, then we're talking about changing market income, market outcomes. And that is to delve into what the processes that cause this distribution in its fundamental, let's say, Piketty way. Or are we talking about post-tax, which is the historical solution of the post-war period, which is the welfare state? The post-tax income says we don't really directly address the pre-tax. We do, because we have standard living at the bottom that we raise, or minimum levels. We have unemployment insurance to prevent you from falling down. Most of these are things that are sitting on top of this intrinsic distribution, the structural distribution. And so post-tax is easier to address because it doesn't threaten, so to speak, the structure. But I would argue that we really need to think about how to actually address the issue of how changing the structural outcome. And as I said, if my results are valid, and we've done them for quite a few countries of the world, then we have to talk about how to change the balance between access to property, income, and labor income. And we know there have been proposals in the past. In some way, pension funds do that for you, but still, obviously, they don't work in a universal way. Then the second point is what are the social means for addressing structural and or racial and gender inequalities? And I want to say what I always say at every talk, which is that depends on your underlying understanding of economic theory. You cannot talk about these unless you have explicitly or implicitly made some commitment to economic theory. Sandy's various papers, and Derek and Sandy's various papers, and Patrick Mason's also, another new schooler, by the way, a graduate of our program, mentioned that orthodox economics says that competitive markets would eliminate all differences that are not merit-based. If markets were allowed to breathe freely, then the only differences you would find are merit-based. And then who wants to interfere with merit-based differences? So what we should do, the standard answer is to let markets breathe freely. And this is what I will call the Scott Walker position for obvious reasons. Heterodox economics says that actual markets are not like these textbook markets, which we all teach, by the way, and then say the world is not like that, but are due to are riddled with imperfections, monopoly power, informational asymmetries, and so on, and therefore we need social intervention to combat the non-merit part of the base differences. And of course, heterodox economists tend to say those non-merit parts are big, and orthodox economists tend to say they're not. But the issue is really a fundamental one about economic theory. Now, I want to mention that this very same issue is fundamental and is repeatedly discussed in issues of global inequality and poverty. I won't bore you with the details of that, but we know that there are enormous differences in income and wealth across the world, and particularly in developing countries, within developing countries, as well as between countries. And that the answer to this inequality, which has been pressed on the developing world for the last 3 decades in what is normally called, now called the neoliberal era, is, I quote, "No protection is the best protection. All economic decisions are best left to the market." This is a quote from one of the officials. Mike Moore, the former Director General of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, says, I quote, "The surest way to do more to help the poor is to continue to open markets." Now, this is not a personal issue, this is a theoretical issue, because he's coming from orthodox theory, and this is a logical, sensible conclusion if you believe orthodox theory. I always think these are not issues of personality, they're nice people on every side, but not all theories have the same implication. Then here, this is the program that is imposed on all countries of the world now, including Greece, by the way, let me just mention. Curtailing union strength so employers can hire and fire whom they choose. The catchphrase is they're making labor markets more competitive. Privatizing state enterprises so their workers will not be protected from private employment in the labor market, and opening up domestic markets to foreign capital and foreign goods. Now, it'd be very easy to draw parallels between these and many policy proposals about race and gender. The heterodox alternative has therefore always been to emphasize global monopoly, market imperfections, informational asymmetries, and the important role of the state in creating development and maintaining it through any means proper or improper. Then, from this point of view, institutions and the state become crucial levers to effect social change. Now, I want to just say parenthetically, because I have a limited time here, that I am not in either camp. I'm not, because I believe that capitalism has a very strong, powerful mechanism for creating its outcomes, and these are how competition works. So if you're going to unleash competition, you're going to unleash those outcomes. And one can show that repeatedly where you have deregulate, you get these outcomes, and people go, whoa, well, of course, that's what markets do. Markets are like nuclear reactors. They have very powerful possibilities, but they do have some side effects, and you do want to stay close to the control rods and the reactor room, because otherwise you'll have outcomes that you cannot reverse, at least not easily. I mention this because I'm not going to talk more about it, but it is the main body of my own work, and my own work will be now forthcoming in a book by Oxford University Press. So in the future, I'll be able to at least point to pages on it here. I want to make two more parallels. Today's New York Times has an article called 1.5 Million Missing Black Men. And that article says that if you look at the difference between the numbers of black men who are not incarcerated and black women who are not incarcerated, then there are 1.5 million missing men in 2010. I recommend reading that article. Now, when I read it, I immediately think of the man that Sandy started by mentioning, which is Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen, very famous article, which was done in 1990 in the London Review of Books, estimated that there were 100 million women missing if you compare it to the men who are born and don't make it to a certain age, and that is because of the selective abortion of girls, infanticide, and other factors which impinge most heavily on women, including health factors and all the stressors that Sandy's talking about. That's 100 million, and those numbers have not gone down in any significant way. The last point, and this is a personal point. I was very much struck in reading again, because I had seen it earlier when Patrick and Sandy were working on this, the question of skin shade and stratification economics. And it reminded me of something which I remember in my personal life, but let me start about sideways. If you look at marriage ads in Indian newspapers, especially the ones that go back before it became not so good manners to mention this, you will see that often, oh yeah, they're still there, I just looked them up today. I don't have time to read you these, but prospective bride or groom is mentioned as being desirable because they are slim and fair. Now, I bring this up because my father comes from the north of India, and he was 6'1" and relatively light-skinned for an Indian. My mother comes from the south of India, came from the south of India, Pune, and she was short and dark-skinned. And my mother was very beautiful, but everybody used to say, she's very beautiful, but she's so dark. Thank you.
I want to say that it's quite alarming that economic researchers, especially in developed countries, are not dedicated to finding out why some groups of people don't live a normal human lifespan. So when we talk about inequality, this inequality in the simplest thing, the simplest human thing, which is to live as long as humans can live, are not distributed equally across groups. And at SCEPA, especially in our work on retirement income security policy, we are increasingly dedicated to sort of judging our policies and our research on that simple contextual question. Sociologist Anton, it's a big sociology night, Anton Antovetsky identified back in 1967, which you all are pretty much familiar with, is that class influences one's chances of staying alive. And we know painfully that at the same level of wealth and income, that socially constructed, not biologically determined. I want to echo Sandy's comments at the very beginning of the talk, that race is socially constructed, it's not biologically determined, that category, race, influences one's chances of staying alive. Now at our retirement income security project, soon to become our newly funded retirement equity lab, we are looking at lifespan differences, access to pension wealth differences, and notably I'm going to concentrate on this, differences in access to pension insurance, and what has been done to people in their working lives to examine the differences in retirement time after we take into account wealth and insurance access and differential lifespans. Part of our work then is to examine the racial gap in mortality, but also morbidity in order to understand retirement policy, and especially I'm going to mention another Republican candidate for president. Not Scott Walker, but Chris Christie. Sorry, he's my governor as well. With his proposal, his reiterated proposal, we hear on the right and the left, however, to raise the retirement age to 68 and beyond, to 70. It sounds benign, but it's a cut in benefits, and that embedded part of our social welfare state has, because it sits on top of, thank you for the language and metaphor, Anwar, sits on top of structural inequality, has very differential effects. So please note graph 1, which comes from the research that I and our very able graduate student, Kyle Moore, this is your shout out, there he is, has been doing for the year, that we find that actually after you have lived your life, you've survived infancy, and so you've surpassed the differential in infant mortality, and you survived your 20s, where we see a big racial gap, especially among men, and your 40s and 50s, where we see a big racial gap. You've made it to 60, but the morbidity between black and white men in that crucial age group, and 20 million Americans are reaching that in the next 5 years. 8,000 Americans are reaching the age of 65 every single day, and that will be true for the next 20 years. That if you're a black man, you already have physically and mentally limitations to your activity, which affects every part of your life. But if you're a white man, you don't face those limitations until you're 67. This is a shorthand way to talk about morbidity, and I think much more relevant for your work than hypertension or other kinds of disease states, because these affect your embeddedness in social activity and also your chances of isolation. So it's much more likely to face these kinds of limitations if you're black or white, and this is actually for men and women. We also find that surviving to age 67, which under the Social Security system is called the normal retirement age, is actually no mean feat. If you're a white man, you have 81% chance of making it to that golden state of retirement, and is actually a much sought after state, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But only 70% chance if you're black. So by the time we reach the period of time that we're looking at, after you've accomplished and finished your working career, the chances of making it to normal retirement age is much, much less. I also want to point out that this work on racial and morbidity gaps has helped me interpret some findings I've had on women that I thought were just anomalous, and that I would knock myself on the side of the head and say, oh, it must be a limitations, and all you social scientists can fill in the blank, must be a limitations in the way I've constructed the variable, the way my sample size must be wrong. But now I can see things that I may not have been brave enough to see. So I found in my work, using the Health and Retirement Survey, which is a longitudinal study, that working women, and I use women that have only worked their entire lives, when I categorize them by wealth and income and education, I did all sorts of ways, that middle-class women have shorter lifespans than lower-income women or higher-income women. And I know that middle-class women, when they've reached these retirement ages, have worked more hours, more weeks, more years than lower-income women. I also know that middle-class women who have worked those hours, those weeks, and years are much less likely to have access to domestic help, they have a few more children, and they certainly have different kinds of jobs than wealthier women who have made it to 65. Middle-class women are much less likely to have jobs where they can control the pace and content of their work. And so now I'm beginning to think that it might be possible to imagine the middle-class women are living shorter lives. And if I had better data, I could even look at the differences in morbidity, because they are in lives where they are posing as full-time dedicated workers. At the same time, they're posing as full-time dedicated mothers. And this double shift and this double dissonance is having the effect of more cortisol load, more disease state. Certainly a hypothesis to test when I have actually, it's going to sound odd, but I need them, more dead workers in my sample. So I am grateful. I am grateful for the workers that died to be in my sample, and I'm quite grateful for my work, my colleagues' work. Now, as I said, that we are very dedicated in SCEPA to look at the unintended, perhaps, but also unseen racial, class, and gender inequality effects of what looks like benign retirement policy, like raising the retirement age. Now, I want to give you a lesson about Social Security. Social Security says that the normal retirement age is age 67. So we all might think in this country, well, we have a norm that legitimate and dignified retirement happens after age 67. But that would be a mistake. We penalize any retirement that happens before the age of 70. Full retirement age, full retirement benefits, your retirement benefit is maximized at age 70. Every year below the age of 70 that you take Social Security, you are being penalized. And that means, since that rule sits on top of structural inequalities, that we have embedded a system where the rate of return to waiting, if you wait between 67 and 70, you get the best deal on the planet. You get an 8% return every year. Your benefits go up 8% every year that you wait to collect after age 67. Now, you could start collecting your benefit at 62, but if you wait, you get a 6 2/3 rate of return increase, which is a pretty good deal across the planet, until you get to 67. So 67 is just an inflection point where the rate of return changes. The reward to wait, to work or not collect until 70 is really the norm that we're setting in our retirement system. And some presidential candidates actually want to reduce that reward of further cut benefits for people who have to take it before age 70. And guess who takes it before age 70? People who don't have the wealth to wait, and people who have work limitations and other reasons and have liquidity reasons to take it earlier. So when you're distinguishing between presidential candidates, don't vote for the ones that want to cut Social Security benefits by raising retirement age. Now, you can't leave the room if that's what you support, and get past me by the door. I also want to amplify this research finding as we're trying to find the pathways, as you said, Sandy, between racism and morbidity and mortality. I think I have a hint from research from another graduate student I had at Notre Dame, where he looked at the differences in morbidity and mortality between closeted gay men and gay men who are out. And this is a nice merger between, you can't buy straightness. And so we found a big sample of gay men who are married to women. But they told the surveyors that they've only had sex with men for the past 5 or years more. So imagine the pain and agony of that kind of a life. Now, these closeted gay men were much more likely to work in non-feminized occupations. And ladies, we know what that means, that they were much more likely to have higher incomes. Okay, so they tried to raise their income by passing as straight men. We also found that their disease states were much more prevalent. Not only just AIDS, but all sorts of other disease states. So even at their higher levels of income they got by being in the closet, they suffer greatly from that secret, from those kinds of pain and agony of being married to a woman and not having sex with women for the past 5 years. He got a fabulous job at the Center for Disease Control, so that's a pro tip for all of you students in the room. But also, I think that you might want to broaden your research to find these pathways beyond skin shade, but also look at other forms of subaltern status. So I will close now to tell us a little bit about how we're advancing this work at SCEPA. We are looking at a different group you are. We're looking at people who have reached age 65, but we're looking back to see what kinds of micro and macroaggressions they had in their labor market experience. And I just want to be keenly aware of what we've done here is that if you're looking at just standard gradients of income and wealth and education on all sorts of outcomes, we also have to be very mindful of the issues of class, race, and gender that have not been isolated in our social science research. So thank you very much for your work, Professors Darity and Derek Hamilton.
Yeah, I mean, so we're gonna let Sandy give a response to the discussions, and then we're gonna take questions from the audience. And let me give a quick heads up. I have to catch a flight, so if you see me run out, it's not out of disgust. It's because I have a flight to catch.
He has to go to Argentina.
I have to go to Argentina. All right, so Sandy.
Wow, okay. So there's a lot to respond to, and I'm not certain I will get to everything. I want to start in what may seem like an odd direction, but I was trying to think about the way in which I think orthodox economists would explain the income distribution and probably the wealth distribution also, which is by taking the position that self-investments in human capital generate the structure of inequality in a society round after round. So I think this is really the conceit of the human capital theorist. So what's the argument? That incomes closely correspond to the productivity characteristics of individuals, and wealth is a product of savings activity, and so the higher an individual's income, the greater their savings and their greater wealth accumulation. So ultimately, human capital is explaining both the income and the wealth distribution. I think this is crazy. But I think the other way to think about it is that there is, in some sense, a pre-existing class structure or pattern of stratification. And then the question is, who gets fit into the various slots? Mm-hmm. And so what's significant for me in terms of this interaction between class and race is the issue of why is it that blacks are disproportionately slotted in to the lowest tiers of the class structure. So I think that the question that is posed in Anwar's comments is really one of a sequence of responses to racial and class inequality. And I'll put it like this quite bluntly. Can we address class inequality without first addressing racial inequality? Or do we have to address class inequality first to address racial inequality? So, I mean, that's a fundamental question. And as I said to the two classes that I met with yesterday, my inclination is to say that racial inequality has to be addressed first, because there are certain privileges and advantages that are associated with being white, regardless of where you are in the white scheme of stratification. I mean, if we take into account the fact that whites with no high school degree have a considerably higher level of wealth than than blacks with a college degree, it would suggest to me that white privilege applies to all whites, regardless of where they lie in the income or the wealth distribution. So as a consequence, politically, you've got to get at that before you can have a situation in which we can think about a real assault on the class structure of the United States, because we'll always have this intervening factor of racial differences. The other observation I want to make is that I certainly think that capitalism produces inequality. Okay, that's intrinsic to the nature of the system. Now, the degree of inequality may vary from moment to moment, but there's a companion problem that we should be aware of. Non-capitalist societies also can produce inequality, depending on what type of non-capitalist society it is. So there's also the issue of what world you make after you unmake the world that you don't desire. And so, we definitely have to be cognizant of that. I was thinking about two other things. One is the Piketty analysis, where one of my problems with the Piketty analysis is that it's completely silent on race, except for about 4 pages where Piketty talks about slavery in the United States being the original point of dramatic inequality in the United States. And I'm not sure that's entirely correct. It certainly could be viewed as a starting point for racial inequality, but we had, there's inequality under feudalism, there's inequality under other kinds of pre-capitalist modes of production. So, to say that that's the starting point for inequality is a little bit inaccurate, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere. But I think Piketty had a slightly different motive there. I think his motive in those 4 pages is really to distinguish or create a narrative of exceptionality for the United States in contrast with Europe and in particular his native France. So, those other societies didn't have the same experience of slavery, so they didn't generate these racial inequalities. Of course, the paradox is that the foundation for economic development of both France and England was the slave trade and the slave plantation system in the Americas, and in fact the cities of Nantes and Bordeaux would not have developed the way that they did if it wasn't for slavery and the slave trade. So I think Piketty's book is very problematic in terms of looking at the relationship between wealth and race, and so I'm not sure what we do with it in that context. And then the last comment I want to make is that theoretically, I'm not an imperfectionist. In fact, I've always wanted to argue that perfectly working capitalist markets make bad things happen. And so, Derek and I have been involved in this project in developing what we call stratification economics. And one of the theoretical contributions we're hoping to make is to argue or demonstrate why a phenomenon like discrimination could persist in a climate of competitive markets. But we can come back to all of that. Now, Teresa. So I think there's a high degree of compatibility between what you were saying and what I was trying to say. And I will be one of the 8,000 Americans, hopefully, to reach 65 years of age in another 3 years or so. Yes, that's right. I'm very, very intrigued by your observation about kind of this U-shaped curve with respect to longevity based on class for women. I was somewhat curious as to whether or not that's independent of race.
Yeah, no, it's the same thing.
It's the same for both, yeah,
exactly.
which
Right,
makes sense.
sorry, should've
Which
said
makes
that.
sense.
Thought you would ask that.
And then I also was intrigued by the can't buy me straightness analysis. And it reminded me a bit of some of the arguments that Nancy Krieger has made, where she's argued that blacks who engage in more denial about their exposure to
Yeah.
discrimination actually carry higher stress
right,
loads
that's
than blacks who say, yeah, that's what happened and I'm pissed about it.
Yeah. Might be working women too. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so would you guys want quick follow-ups, and then I'll go to
No, I'm
questions?
good. Let's
Okay.
go to the audience.
All right, so,
Can I, wait, I do,
go ahead.
I want to make a very, a quick point, but,
Sorry.
you know, if you think about that every group who is subject to inequality has a good reason to focus on their group's inequality, then obviously if everybody did it together, you won't be able to maintain the inequality. But if you do it separately, then you follow the path of many ethnic groups throughout the history of every country, which is that they move up the ladder, leaving space and other people in the ladder. Or as Sandy said, the slots are there, and the debate only becomes about who fills the slots. And that's why I think it's not a good idea to separate inequality as a whole from the inequality of your own preferred group. I've
So-
always had that
yeah,
argument.
Good point. And actually, you know, I deflected talking about policy. But the two policies that I think are most imperative in this society, if we're going to avoid dissolution into anarchy, are number one, a federal guarantee of employment for all citizens at non-poverty wages, and number two, a redistributive mechanism where every newborn infant is provided with an endowment or a trust fund by the public sector that they can access at 18 years of age, and the amount of that endowment would be graduated based upon the wealth position of their families. So yes, in a sense, what that would do is that would leave capitalism in place, but it would leave capitalism in place under very different conditions. In fact, if we're concerned about the minimum wage every 2 or 3 years, the federal job guarantee would be the de facto minimum wage. It would set the floor on what the private sector would have to pay people, because folks could always resort to the public sector employment as an alternative.
all right, so I'm going to lead off with perhaps a somewhat self-serving question that somebody asked in the audience. Do you see stratification economics as a heterodox school of economics or as an extension of the mainstream? How so?
Nice.
Well, I'm not sure if I want to cluster it with heterodox economics, but I'm okay with that. I definitely don't see it as an extension of mainstream economics. Yeah.
Oh, that was a short answer, okay. All right, so the next question relates to a comparison between immigrant and U.S.-born blacks in the 5 cities. Did you see any differences? And then as a follow-up, somebody also asked, well, this is somebody different, but I'll give you both questions at once. Is the mechanism relating racism, stress, and health outcomes the perception of microaggressions and racism? For example, recent black African immigrants often lack the context to recognize immediately microaggressions. Do these groups suffer the same stress health outcomes as, I guess, more U.S. slave descendant blacks?
That's an excellent question. I mean, the question is ignorance bliss, or, you know, are you insulated by not being aware of what has actually just happened to you? That's a tricky one, because there's the Nancy Krieger problem of individuals who are engaged in denial. Now, the question is, do you have some sense that what occurred to you was racialized? And so that's a very, very, very tricky issue. I think we need to explore that more. I think that's a really critical question. Certainly, I think an argument can be made that the immigrant generation is more likely to either ignore or reinterpret what has occurred to them than their sons and daughters. And so there's frequently a rift in the family across generations in terms of questions of racial identification. But with respect to the other question as to whether or not we found differences between immigrant blacks and non-immigrant blacks, yeah, there are some differences. It depends on the city. If I take the most recent study that we've completed, the study on Boston, which is called The Color of Wealth in Boston, we find that I think black U.S. black, yeah, table 9 or something. Is it table 9? Is table 9 the Cuban? Yeah, table 9. Comparison of white and non-white household median net worth. And so we find for U.S. descended blacks, now this is an amazing statistic, median net worth was $8 in Boston.
Yeah, that's good.
Like $8,
That's
okay?
good. That's good.
For Puerto Ricans, it was $3,020. For Caribbean blacks, it was $12,000, and for Dominicans, it was $0. For whites in Boston, the median net worth was $247,500. So there is some variation that's evident there among the folks who we would putatively describe as black, but it's still dramatically lower than the white median. And we use the medians because presumably that's not affected by the outlying values in the way that the mean might be. Yeah.
So addressing wealth may help people deal with health issues, and it's certainly important, but it does not help people unlearn racism and microaggressions. How, if at all, can it be addressed through policy?
Well, I guess I'm not that touchy-feely, so I'm not sure how you teach people to be better behaved. There was a literature years ago that was prompted by Gordon Allport's book, The Nature of Prejudice, where the argument was made that if you had contact between groups, this would improve relations. And to be fair to Allport, there were very particular conditions that he imposed on the nature of the contact for it to have that effect. But we rarely replicate those conditions. I mean, if we think about school desegregation as an experiment in contact, one of his conditions was that the groups have to meet on equal terms. And, black and white students have never entered the same schools on equal terms. I mean, so you don't even meet his first condition. So I kind of avoid worrying about how we change people's attitudes and try to think more about what kinds of resources can we give people who are subjected to the harms of those attitudes to better protect themselves.
Can I ask a question?
Sure. Yeah, I also wanted to,
Yeah.
please go ahead.
Okay, so this is a question. So wealth, you say, I'm finally getting this. Wealth, you say, is important for stabilizing income. Yeah. That what's a big difference, why that's important is that whites have much more of a cushion. Yeah. And my colleague Claire Brown once said that if you had another job, or if you had a guarantee of a job, or if you had wealth, essentially what you don't really care about is the guarantee or the wealth, you actually want the cushion, that you can stabilize income. So I'm actually wondering why your research, your policy implications, don't focus on the availability of insurance more than you do. And it wouldn't be also helpful to talk about expanding Social Security, unemployment insurance, perhaps you like the earned income tax credit, rather than focusing on these two things, on jobs and wealth.
Okay, so first of all, the notion of the wealth proposal that we have in mind is actually to extend Social Security across the lifetime.
Yeah.
That is to say, at 18 years of
Yeah,
age,
exactly.
in some sense, individuals first begin to receive a Social Security payment. But they're really getting an initial set of funds that will permit them to build, to purchase assets that could build their wealth across the lifetime. The notion of the job guarantee is to include certain forms of insurance as part of, as part of the perks associated with the employment, especially medical insurance. Now, why are we not thinking about unemployment insurance? Well, the presumption is that the existence of job guarantee is the unemployment insurance. Now, there obviously are going to be some people who are going to be physically unable.
It's called disability insurance.
Right, and we would want to maintain that, of course, but it's the job guarantee. Well, the other thing is, in making the case for the job guarantee, trying to make it persuasive, we try to argue that you could eliminate a host of so-called entitlement programs because they wouldn't be needed. Now, of course, that's deeply contingent on ensuring that the lowest paid public sector job is above poverty wages. Yeah.
But it usually is,
I wanted to, you may find this comment a bit strange, but I think we should not reduce any group to income and wealth without talking about culture and religion and social place. These are not identical, but they're very important throughout history in protecting people against the 1,000 cuts that they receive daily. And that's a non-trivial thing, because when we think as economists or as intellectuals, academics, we tend to leave out the things that people themselves have invented to protect themselves. And I think this is more reflection of our loss of those things than it is a reflection of our analysis, really. And so I would argue that any political movement, and everything we're talking about is essentially political, has learned that you have to create a culture of that politics too. You have to celebrate that culture because it protects you and keeps you literally alive as you go through all those struggles.
I mean, that might relate to the integration debate, right? So is integration the key? Maybe, maybe not, right? So I guess if you're integrating in a hostile environment, that obviously isn't going to be healthy. So I think by integration, what we really mean is inclusion. That's probably a better word than integration. Right. Inclusion and the access to what I would say is material resources so that you can have human capabilities or agency to make choices in one's life. Did you? Oh, no, okay. All right, so another question. Regarding the stated relationship between education, race, and wealth, is education the answer? Your statements are correct, but focus on educational attainment. But if blacks are in lousy schools, then this tells us little about the relative cognitive skill development, so-called school quality for blacks, is part of the answer, right? So I guess this is the question of quantity versus quality.
Yeah, okay, so, you know, I heard something like that on a radio program, and I kept trying to figure out if the person was trying to tell me that whites who had not finished high school were better educated than blacks who had finished college because of quality differences in the schooling. That's all I have to say about that.
All right, I'll give you another one. If discrimination, gender, racial, etc., continue as one acquires wealth, education, etc., how can wealth alone solve the problem? Furthermore, the stressors are acting on genes that increase cortisol, which influences immune responses. This epigenetic reprogramming can be passed down to the next generation, thus keeping groups suppressed. Did you write this one? I did not write any of these questions. I disavowed myself from these questions.
I want to see the handwriting.
I've been talking about this.
No, it's part of our discussion.
Okay, so I think I tried to talk about that toward the end of my comments, where I said, yeah, this is a potential issue. It's not clear that greater levels of wealth would reduce exposure to microaggressions. In fact, certainly increased income
The BMW.
might be associated with that.
Okay.
Yeah, but then I said, so racialized stressors may not alter significantly, but maybe we could eliminate another set of stressors that people are confronted with, particularly due to the insecurity of their income flows, that would actually be beneficial. So now, is that offsetting? I don't know, but it you know, like I said, let's do it and see what happens.
Can I make a comment on that? Because it strikes me that there's a relation between these issues. As you move up wealth from any group that has suffered discrimination, you also become more isolated as you move up. And this is what I meant about the culture thing. You experience more of exactly the things that you started off with. In your wealth compensate to some extent, but everybody knows that that may not be sufficient, may not even be essential as far as your bodily and somatic responses. So that may be one way to look at it, is to see the degree to which your isolation, the percentage of that population that you're in, may be a variable that might load in here.
Well, yeah, and that's absolutely right. I think that, you know, rightly or wrongly, I think that we're envisioning trying to reduce isolation by having more and more people have similar levels of wealth. But yeah, I mean, to the extent that we don't succeed in doing that, then you have the same issue that you're raising.
Yeah, I mean, the baby bonds is designed to address the source of inequality at its face, right? If one believes that the source is, you know, people, for the most part, don't engage in active savings. They access some instrument that will allow for automatic savings over their life course. And oftentimes when you're a young adult, you get some transfer that allows you the capital to purchase some big asset that's going to appreciate over your lifetime. And some families, simply by birthright, will be born into a network where they're going to receive that transfer. So baby bonds are designed to seed everybody with an opportunity. Doesn't give a guarantee. So as Teresa mentioned, it in and of itself is not social security per se, but as Sandy mentioned, he's correct that we envision we have resources set aside for people in their twilight, but not a lot of resources when they're just entering their life course as a young adult beyond just subsistence. So baby bonds are intended to give people that seed capital so that they can engage in the purchase of an asset so that they can have the economic security associated with that automatic savings.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment about the epigenetic thing, which is a set of ideas that are both attractive and disturbing to me. So the attractiveness is, I think epigenetics emerges as an attempt to restore a certain degree of primacy to environmental factors in people's life outcomes. On the other hand, because trait expression in subsequent generations is affected by a trauma that's experienced by the first generation, it almost restores genetic explanations for the outcomes that we're examining. And so I'm a little reluctant to jump on the epigenetics train entirely. So that's just my comment. Yeah.
Don't abandon it. In the health and retirement survey, they're actually putting, they're sequencing the genes of the people in the survey. And epidemiologists and ethicists and social scientists are beginning a conversation about how to use that data.
Okay.
So let's not, it's an error term, let's not bring it out because of eugenics.
Yeah.
So I'm going to end by asking the panelists to think about policy. And Sandy's started with policy, so I'm going to give him the last word. But start with Teresa and then Anwar and ask what policies, if ignore the political science question of we can't get anything passed. But if you could envision and design a policy, what would it be to address it?
So I'm really interested in the distribution of dignified time off. Just as we've seen the battle for a 8-hour day or a labor holiday or recently paid sick leave. I am engaged in the battle for dignified time off at the end of your working life. And what we have found is this huge amount of inequality in access to that dignified time on the way at the end of your life. That's the one place where being able to retire with dignity is constructed, is only available to those that have lived a good life or have the means to not be dependent. So that's where our passion is, and we can't forget the inequality in dignity and the inequality of the access to time.
Okay, thank you. Anwar?
Yeah, I think Sandy made an important point that inequality is something that one can observe throughout history in various degrees, and so you always have to worry about what you're going to get from what you change. But we do have some things we can learn. I believe it's possible to reduce inequality as a whole. Now, this comes from the idea that the linchpin of the overall inequality is really the distribution of property income relative to actual income. One of the startling things that we found in some studies that Noe Wiener and I did, which is to look at the distribution of income by race and gender. Now, you know, you look at it overall, it follows a pattern which can be shown in a particular kind of scale to be a straight line. So we actually expected it would never hold if you look at it by race, but it does. And that raises a really interesting question. What is the theory of the distribution of income within racial groups and gender groupings? I don't know the answer to that, but I can show you the data, which is quite always a good place to start. So that would be the first thing, to talk about how to change the structural inequality, because that benefits everybody, I would think. And the second, obviously, is to integrate into that change structure. But the third is to restore the welfare state. It's only in the US that we don't have talk about the obvious things like free education and free health care. I mean, that's so obvious and it's so general that we need to, and the baby bond kind of thing is a part of a welfare state ethic. It's a long-standing one. And the third is to read and learn about all the alternatives to capitalism which are now springing up throughout the world, and perhaps they're not going to survive. Perhaps they won't survive any better than the old co-op movements and the hippie communes, but by God, we should be listening to what they're talking about because we may need them someday. Okay. All right, last word.
Yeah, so, you know, I think I conceive of the baby bonds proposal as a property redistribution mechanism. But a more explicit property redistribution mechanism was exercised in Malaysia, where during what was then called the New Economic Policy between 1970 and 1990, the Malaysian government held shares of stock in Malaysian-owned corporations in a trust to provide to the native Malays. And there's some deep issues about how much corruption was involved in that process, which native Malays were the ones who got the greatest amount of shares. But the premise or the principle was essentially a property redistribution mechanism. And so I think we might want to examine that experience in some depth if we're thinking about trying to change the ratio between property and wage income. The other thing I want to mention is that both the baby bonds proposal and the federal job guarantee are conceived of as universal programs. Everybody in the society every newborn infant would be eligible for it. Every adult would be eligible for the job guarantee. This arises in part after thinking about proposals that might have a benefit for all, but a disproportionate benefit for those who are worse off. But if you come down to it, you might know that in my work, I've done a substantial amount of advocacy for reparations for African Americans, which is a particularistic program. And my wife and I have a book coming out called From Here to Equality, which is on reparations. And so I've been advocating both a particularistic policy to address the very specific history and damages that have been exercised against the Black American community, simultaneously with advocating universal programs. And I guess I feel like the universal programs are more likely to be embraced, but that's another piece of of the way in which I'm thinking about how we transform America.
So before we close, I want to point out Alan Aha and Daniel Bustillo, who have both co-authored with us on both the baby bonds and federal job guarantee, and are both former New School students. All right, so thank you.
Sandy, I hope that we can have your wife and yourself back when the book is published.
Oh, that'd be terrific.
Would really like to explore ways to redistribute wealth. Thank you very much for coming, and we hope to see you at our next event. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.